My name is Kevin Mason, and I was 16 when my family dragged me on what turned out to be the strangest and scariest expedition of my life. It was October 1991, and we were parked in our custom-built Winnebago RV at the base of Devil's Tower in Wyoming. My dad, Dr. Howard Mason, was a cryptozoologist obsessed with proving the existence of creatures most people think are just myths. Bigfoot, sea monsters, you name it. He believed they were real. My mom, Linda, was his partner in all this madness. She built the equipment he used to track down these creatures. And then there was my little sister, Angela, who was only 8, but somehow always seemed to know things she shouldn't. I didn't want to be there. I should have been at school, hanging out with my friends or working on my tech projects. Instead, I was stuck setting up cameras and sensors in the middle of nowhere while Dad lectured us about Bigfoot sightings near Devil's Tower. He said this place had a history of strange activity, lights in the sky, weird noises, and even reports of giant footprints. He was convinced we'd find something during the meteor shower happening that week. The first night was quiet, too quiet. We set up motion sensors around the RV and calibrated Dad's EMF detectors to measure electromagnetic disturbances. Mom said the readings were off the charts for such a remote area, but Dad just grinned like he'd hit the jackpot. Angela sat inside drawing pictures with her crayons, humming to herself like she always did when she was deep in thought. When I went to check the cameras later that night, I found something weird. There were footprints, large ones pressed into the dirt near one of the sensors. But here's the thing, they started out of nowhere and ended just as suddenly, like whoever made them had appeared and disappeared without walking away. "Dad," I yelled, pointing at them. He rushed over with his notebook and started sketching them while muttering excitedly about evidence. Angela tugged on my sleeve as I stood there watching him work. "The people in the trees are talking," she whispered. "What people?" I asked. She just shrugged and went back to her crayons. That night, we recorded strange sounds on Dad's audio equipment, low-frequency noises that made my chest feel heavy when I listened to them. Dad said they were infrasound signals, possibly communication between creatures. Mom wasn't so sure but admitted it wasn't something she'd ever heard before. As we settled into bed, Angela kept saying she could hear voices outside. "They're watching us," she whispered from her bunk. I told her to go to sleep, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling she might be right. The next morning, things started getting weird. Really weird. It began when Mom noticed the equipment wasn't working right. The motion sensors would go off randomly, but when we checked, there was nothing there. The cameras would record fine for hours, then suddenly glitch out whenever something unusual happened. At first, Dad thought it was just technical issues, but Mom said the failures were happening in patterns, like someone was deliberately messing with them. Angela was acting strange too. She sat outside with her crayons, drawing pictures of tall figures standing in the trees. "They were watching us," she said calmly, like it was no big deal. When I asked her who they were, she just smiled and said, "Tall Singer told me." "Who stut's Tall Singer?" I asked. She pointed toward the forest. "He seps one of them. He says they sep curious about us." Dad overheard and immediately started asking her questions, like she was some kind of witness in an investigation. Angela didn't seem scared though. She seemed connected, like she understood something we couldn't. That night, things got even creepier. We were sitting in the RV reviewing the audio recordings from the previous night when we heard something new, voices. They were faint and distorted, but they sounded like words being spoken in a language none of us recognized. Dad's eyes lit up with excitement. "This is it," he said. "They're trying to communicate." Mom wasn't so sure. She kept rubbing her temples like she had a headache and muttered about how the electromagnetic readings were getting stronger. Even I could feel it. My laptop kept shutting down for no reason, and the air around us felt heavy, almost electric. Later that night, I saw something. Or at least I think I did. I was checking one of the cameras near the edge of our camp when I noticed movement in the trees. It was tall, way taller than any person I'd ever seen, and it seemed to be watching me from the shadows. My heart started pounding as I tried to focus the camera on it, but just as I hit record, the screen glitched out completely. When I told Dad what happened, He grabbed his flashlight and ran out to investigate, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. Angela didn't seem surprised when we came back empty-handed. "They don't want you to see them," she said quietly. The strangest thing happened later that night. Dad's research journals, his most prized possessions, had been tampered with. He swore he locked them up before bed, but when he opened them in the morning, some of his notes had been rewritten with information he didn't remember writing down. The handwriting looked like his, but the words weren't. They described things like social hierarchies and communication methods for creatures that sounded a lot like Bigfoot. Mom was starting to get worried now. She kept saying something wasn't right about this place, that we should pack up and leave before things got worse. But Dad wouldn't hear it. He was convinced we were on the verge of a breakthrough. Angela kept predicting things before they happened: equipment failures, strange noises outside, and every time she did, she'd say it was because Tall Singer told her so. I didn't know what to believe anymore. All I knew was that something or someone was out there watching us. By the third day, everything felt off. It wasn't just the equipment or the strange noises anymore. It was us. We were changing, and I didn't know how to stop it. Dad was the first to act different. He started talking to himself, muttering things under his breath that didn't make sense. At first I thought he was just stressed, but then he started answering questions we hadn't even asked. "It's a social hierarchy," he said suddenly during breakfast, staring into space. "They communicate through shared thoughts." "Who are you talking about?" Mom asked. "The forest people," he replied, like it was obvious. "They sup's been here longer than us. They sup were watching how we think." Mom looked at him like he'd lost his mind, but she didn't say anything. I think she was scared to admit she felt it too. She'd been having trouble with the equipment. Things she used to fix in minutes were suddenly impossible for her to figure out. She said it felt like her knowledge was slipping away, like someone was pulling it out of her head. Angela was still drawing those strange symbols, more detailed now, almost scientific. She showed me one of her pictures and said it was a brain. "Tall Singer says this is how they think," she explained. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could an 8-year-old know about brain structures? But when I looked closer at her drawing, it didn't look human. It looked advanced, like something out of a science book. I tried to focus on my own work, but even I wasn't immune to whatever was happening. My thoughts felt jumbled, like I couldn't tell where my ideas ended and someone else's began. When I recorded audio near the forest that night, I heard footsteps, lots of them. But when I played it back later, there were voices mixed in with the sounds. They weren't speaking English, but somehow I understood them. They were talking about us, evaluating us. Mom found something that night that made everything worse. Old government documents hidden in a storage compartment in the RV. They were faded and hard to read, but the words telepathic interference tests stood out clearly. "What is this?" she asked Dad, holding up the papers. He barely looked at them before saying, "They sip always been here." The government knew but couldn't have controlled them. I didn't know what scared me more, that Dad seemed to understand what was happening, or that Mom couldn't argue with him anymore. Angela started predicting things before they happened, like when the cameras would fail or when Dad would have one of his strange episodes. "Tall Singer doesn't like the noise machines," she said when one of the EMF detectors stopped working completely. I tried sending an emergency message to one of Dad's old colleagues at his university, someone who might be able to help, but every time I got close to finishing it, the computer shut down on its own. When I checked the wiring later, it looked like someone had tampered with it from inside the RV. That night, none of us slept well. We all woke up at exactly 3 a.m., gasping for air after having the same dream, a circle of tall figures surrounding us in the forest, their glowing eyes staring into our souls. I wanted to believe it was just paranoia or stress getting to us, but deep down I knew the truth. We weren't alone anymore. By the fourth night, it felt like the forest was alive. The air was heavy, buzzing with a strange energy that made my skin crawl. None of us talked much anymore. It was like we didn't need to. We could feel each other's thoughts, like whispers in the back of our minds. It wasn't normal. It wasn't us. The RV felt smaller and smaller as the tension grew. Mom kept pacing. rubbing her temples like she was trying to block something out. Dad sat at the table, scribbling in his notebook, but the pages were filled with symbols now, just like Angela's drawings. He didn't even look up when I asked him what he was writing. Angela was the calmest of all of us. She sat by the window staring into the dark forest. "They sept close now," she said softly. "They sept are deciding." "Deciding what?" I asked, my voice shaking. She turned to me, her big brown eyes somehow older than they should have been. If we stay human or if we join them, that was it for me. I grabbed Mom by the arm and said, "We need to leave. Now." But before we could even start packing, everything went wrong. The lights in the RV flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. The air outside filled with a low hum, a sound so deep it made my chest vibrate. The motion sensors around our camp started beeping wildly, one after another, until they all went silent at once. "They said we're here," Angela whispered. Dad stood up suddenly, his face pale but determined. "Don't fight it," he said, his voice distant, almost robotic. "This is evolution." Mom snapped out of her daze and grabbed him by the shoulders. "Howard, listen to yourself. This isn't set right. We need to get out of here." But he just smiled, a strange, empty smile that sent chills down my spine. Before we could stop him, he opened the RV door and stepped outside into the night. "Dad," I shouted, running after him. The forest was pitch black except for the faint glow of the meteor shower overhead. I couldn't see him anymore, but I could hear movement all around me. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, heavy footsteps circling us. Mom pulled me back inside and locked the door. "We can't go out there," she said, her voice trembling. But then we noticed something else. Angela was gone. Her bed was empty except for a circle of pine needles arranged neatly where she had been lying. "Angela!" Mom screamed, throwing open the door again, despite her own warning. We stumbled into the clearing outside the RV, shouting Angela's name over and over. But there was no sign of her, just that same low hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then Mom froze, she clutched her head and fell to her knees, groaning in pain. "They spore in my head," she gasped. "I can feel them." I tried to help her up, but she pushed me away and looked at me with eyes that didn't seem like hers anymore. They were glowing faintly in the moonlight, reflective like an animal's eyes caught in headlights. "I have to go," she said suddenly, standing up and turning toward the forest. "What? No. Mom." I grabbed her arm, but she was stronger than I expected, stronger than she should have been. "They said are calling me," she said calmly, pulling away from me. "I understand now." And just like that, she walked into the trees without looking back. I wanted to go after her. I really did, but then I heard Dad Sip's voice behind me. "Kevin, get inside." I turned around to see him standing at the edge of the clearing, his face pale and his hands shaking. He looked terrified, more terrified than I'd ever seen him before. "We can save them," he said quietly. "We have to go." I didn't want to believe him, but deep down I knew he was right. Whatever had taken Angela and Mom wasn't going to let them come back, not as they were before. We ran back to the RV together and tried to drive away, but none of the electronics worked, not even the engine. It was like everything had been drained of power completely. "Come on," Dad shouted as he grabbed a flashlight and pulled me out of the RV. We shall go on foot. We stumbled through the dark forest for what felt like hours, tripping over roots and branches as that low hum followed us everywhere we went. My head felt like it was going to split open from the pressure. It was like they were inside my mind too now, whispering things I couldn't understand. Finally, we reached a ranger station at dawn, a small wooden building with a radio tower on top. The rangers looked at us like we were crazy when we tried to explain what had happened. "There's nothing out there," one of them said firmly. "No footprints, no signs of anyone else being here." But I knew they were wrong. I could still feel them watching us from somewhere deep in those woods. It's been 5 years since that night. 5 years since I lost my mom and Angela to the forest. 5 years since Dad was institutionalized for what they called paranoid delusions. But I know the truth. I felt the truth. And now it's pulling me back. I'm Kevin Mason, 21 years old, and I'm standing at the edge of Devil's Tower again. I don't know why I came back. Maybe it's the dreams, the ones where I see their faces in the trees calling to me. Or maybe it's the coordinates that appeared on my computer last week, ones I didn't type, but somehow knew were meant for me. The forest hasn't changed. It's still quiet, still heavy with that strange energy. As I walk deeper into the woods, everything feels familiar. The hum in the air, the way the shadows seem to move even when there's no wind. It's like stepping back into a nightmare. And then I see it. Our old RV. It's still here, hidden beneath layers of moss and vines like the forest has swallowed it whole. My heart pounds as I step closer, brushing away leaves from the door. The symbols Angela used to draw are etched into the metal now. Hundreds of them, covering every inch of the RV's surface. Inside, it's exactly how we left it. Dad's notebooks are still on the table, filled with those strange drawings and rewritten notes. Angela's crayons are scattered across her bunk, her last picture pinned to the wall, a tall figure standing in a circle of trees. But there's something new here too. More journals, pages and pages of writing in Mom's handwriting, describing things she couldn't have known before, things about evolution, about thought projection, about becoming something more than human. I flip through one of the journals and freeze when I see a drawing of a face, Mom's face, but her eyes are glowing like they did that night in the forest. They soar here, a voice whispers behind me. I spin around, flashlight trembling in my hand, but there's no one there, just shadows shifting between the trees. But I can feel them watching me. I step outside and look toward the forest, my breath catching in my throat as tall figures begin to emerge from the shadows. They're massive, 8 or 9 feet tall, with reddish-brown hair and glowing eyes that seem to pierce right through me. And then I realize, I know them. One of them steps closer, and even though its face isn't human anymore, I recognize her instantly. "Mom?" I whisper. She doesn't say anything. She doesn't need to. Her thoughts flood my mind all at once. Memories of our family, of Angela laughing as she drew pictures, of Dad trying to explain his theories about evolution. And then something else, something deeper, a feeling of peace, like she's finally where she belongs. Another figure steps forward, smaller than the rest. Angela. She looks up at me with those glowing eyes and smiles like nothing ever happened. "We're waiting for you," her voice echoes in my head. I stumble backward, shaking my head. No, this isn't sept real. But when I turn around to run back to the RV, I catch my reflection in its window and my heart stops. My eyes, they start glowing too. I drop the flashlight and fall to my knees as their thoughts pour into me. Images of forests untouched by humanity, of creatures living in harmony with nature, of a future where humans evolve into something greater than themselves. And then I feel it. Acceptance. They're not forcing me, they're offering me a choice. The figures fade back into the trees as I sit there alone in the clearing, staring at my reflection until it disappears with them. But deep down, I know this isn't over. They'll wait for me for as long as it takes. My name is Thomas Wilson. I'm 58 years old, a retired steel mill worker, and a World War II veteran. My wife, Margaret, and I have been married for 35 years. We've worked hard all our lives, saved every penny we could, and finally, we're taking the trip we always dreamed of, a summer vacation in our brand new Airstream. It's a shiny silver beauty, just 16 feet long, but it's ours. Margaret calls it our little home on wheels. We decided to visit the Olympic National Forest in Washington State. Whispering Pines Campground sounded perfect, quiet, surrounded by towering trees and far away from the noise of the city. The drive there was peaceful. Margaret kept pointing out birds she recognized, and I couldn't help but smile at how excited she was. When we arrived at the campground, the place felt different. The trees were massive, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the sunlight. It was like stepping into another world, darker, quieter, and colder than I expected for summer. But Margaret loved it right away. She said it felt untouched, like nature had been left alone here for centuries. Setting up the Airstream wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. The ground was uneven, and I struggled to get everything level. I got frustrated, more than I should have, and it brought back flashes of my time in the war. It happens sometimes when things go wrong. My mind drifts back to those days in France. Margaret noticed and put her hand on my shoulder. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She always knows when I need her calm presence to pull me back to reality. Later that afternoon, Margaret wandered off to explore while I finished setting up camp. She came back with a story about meeting an elderly man named Edwin Holcomb, who was camping nearby in an old RV. He told her the campground used to be a logging site until something happened back in 1932, an accident, he called it. He didn't say much more than that, just warned us not to go into the forest after dark if we heard strange voices calling our names. That night, as we sat by the campfire roasting marshmallows, I started to feel uneasy. The forest seemed too quiet. No crickets chirping, no rustling leaves, just silence. Then we heard it, a faint whisper coming from the trees. "Thomas." I froze. Margaret looked at me with wide eyes and whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded slowly. "It's probably just the wind," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. The whisper came again, this time louder. "Margaret." We both stood up and stared into the darkness beyond the firelight. There was nothing there, just shadows between the trees. Edwin's warning echoed in my mind, "Don't go into the forest after dark if you hear someone calling." The next morning, I went outside to check on the Airstream and noticed something strange, long scratches running down one side of it. They were deep enough to scrape through the shiny silver surface, but too high up for any animal I could think of to have made them. I called Margaret over to take a look. She frowned and said, "Maybe a branch fell during the night." But there were no fallen branches nearby, and these scratches weren't random. They looked deliberate, like claw marks. That was when I started feeling like we weren't alone at Whispering Pines. The scratches on the Airstream stayed with me all morning. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Margaret tried to brush it off, saying it was probably just an animal, but I could tell she was uneasy too. She kept glancing at the tree line like she was expecting to see something or someone watching us. Later that day, while Margaret was sitting outside with her binoculars, trying to spot birds, she suddenly called out to me, "Thomas, come here." I stepped out of the Airstream and followed her gaze to the edge of the forest. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I caught a glimpse of movement, a figure standing just inside the shadows of the trees. It looked like a deer, but something about it wasn't right. Its body was too still, its head tilted at an odd angle, and its antlers seemed wrong. They were jagged and uneven, almost like they were broken or covered in something dark. When I took a step closer to get a better look, it vanished, just like that. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone. "Did you see that?" Margaret asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know what I saw," I admitted. "Probably just a deer, but deep down, I didn't believe that." That afternoon, a park ranger stopped by our campsite to check our permits. His name was Officer Jenkins, a tall man with a friendly smile and a thick mustache. He seemed nice enough, but when we mentioned the scratches on our Airstream and the strange figure in the woods, his expression changed. "You folks should be careful out here," he said, his tone serious now. "We had 3 hikers go missing in this area over the past month." "Missing?" Margaret repeated, her voice rising slightly. Jenkins nodded. "Search teams haven't found a trace of them, not even footprints." He hesitated before adding, "If you hear anything strange or see anything unusual, don't go looking for it. Stay in your RV and lock your doors." After he left, Margaret and I sat in silence for a long time. The cheerful excitement we'd felt when we first arrived was gone now, replaced by a heavy sense of unease. That night was worse than the first. I couldn't sleep. Every little sound outside made me jump. Around midnight, I heard something moving near the Airstream. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, but when I peeked out the window, there was nothing there. I finally drifted off sometime after 2 a.m., but my sleep was restless and filled with nightmares. In one dream, I was back in France during the war, hiding in a trench while enemy soldiers closed in around me. But this time there was something else there. A tall, skeletal figure standing just beyond the smoke and rubble, watching me with glowing eyes. When I woke up drenched in sweat, Margaret wasn't in bed beside me. "Margaret?" I called out softly. "I vest him here," she answered from outside. I got up and opened the door to find her standing just a few feet away from the airstream, staring into the woods. "What are you doing out here?" I asked. She turned to me with wide eyes. "I thought I heard you calling me," she said quietly. "I didn't call you," I said firmly. Her face went pale as she realized what that meant. The next morning, we decided to check on Edwin Holcomb, the elderly camper Margaret had met earlier, but when we reached his RV, we found it abandoned. The door had been ripped clean off its hinges, and inside, well, let's just say it looked like someone or something had torn through everything in a blind rage. On his small dining table were old newspaper clippings about Wendigo territory. The articles talked about strange disappearances dating back decades and described a creature that sounded eerily similar to what we'd seen near the trees. Tall, emaciated, with antlers like a deer but far more sinister. Margaret looked at me with fear in her eyes. "Thomas, what if it's Sips real?" I didn't have an answer for her. By late afternoon, the temperature had dropped sharply, even though it was still summer, and a thick fog began rolling in from the forest. It wasn't natural. This fog moved too quickly and seemed almost alive as it crept through the trees toward our campsite. That evening, as we huddled inside the airstream trying to stay warm despite the sudden cold snap, we heard another voice calling from outside. It wasn't just any voice, it was my old war buddy Charlie's voice, the same Charlie who had died in my arms all those years ago. "Tommy, help me." Hearing Charlie's voice froze me in place. My heart started pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Margaret grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice trembling, "that Sip's not real." "It can Sip be," but it sounded so real. The tone, the way he said my name, it was exactly how Charlie used to talk to me during the war. "Tommy, please. I need you." The voice came again, this time closer. It was coming from the woods, just beyond the fog. I wanted to believe Margaret, I really did, but a part of me couldn't ignore it. What if? What if somehow he was out there? What if he needed me? "I have to check," I said, pulling away from Margaret's grip. "No," she hissed, grabbing my arm again. "You Sip not going out there. You know it Sip's not him." I hesitated, torn between reason and instinct. Then I heard it again, Charlie's voice, but now it sounded like he was in pain. "Tommy, help me. If Furm hurt." Margaret stepped in front of me, blocking the door. "Thomas Wilson, you are not leaving this camper," she said firmly, her eyes blazing with fear and determination. She was right. Deep down, I knew she was right. Whatever was out there wasn't Charlie. It couldn't be. But hearing his voice stirred something deep inside me that I couldn't explain. We stayed inside the airstream for hours after that, listening as the voice continued to call out to me from the woods. Sometimes it sounded desperate. Other times it sounded angry, like it was mocking me for not coming to help. Then the voices changed. Margaret. It was my voice now, calling her name from outside in a calm, familiar tone that sent chills down my spine. Margaret Sip's face went pale as she looked at me and whispered, "Thomas, that Sip's you." "I know," I said quietly, gripping her hand tightly as we both stared at the locked door. The fog outside grew thicker and colder until we could see our breath inside the airstream. The windows frosted over, and the metal walls creaked like they were being pushed in by some invisible force. Then we heard scratching, long, slow scratches across the side of the airstream. Margaret clung to me as the sound moved around us, circling the camper like a predator stalking its prey. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of our own breathing, "what is it?" I didn't have an answer for her, not one that made sense anyway. Suddenly there was a loud bang on the roof, like something heavy had landed on top of us, and Margaret screamed. "Stay here," I said, grabbing the flashlight and stepping toward the door. "Don't you dare go out there." she cried. But I had to see what was happening. I opened the door just enough to shine the flashlight outside, but saw nothing except swirling fog and shadows. Then I heard it, a low growl that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was deep and guttural, almost like a mix between a growl and a scream. I slammed the door shut and locked it as fast as I could. "We're not safe here," I said to Margaret as I grabbed my hunting rifle from under the bed. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I'm going to check on Officer Jenkins," I said. "If anyone knows what SIP's going on out here, it SIPs him." Margaret didn't argue this time. She just nodded silently and handed me my coat. I stepped outside into the freezing fog with my rifle in one hand and a flashlight in the other. The air felt wrong, too cold for summer and too still for a forest at night. As I made my way toward Jenkins's Ranger truck parked near his cabin at the edge of the campground, I kept hearing whispers all around me, faint voices calling my name from every direction. When I reached his truck, I found it empty, but something wasn't right about it either. The driver's side door was wide open, and there were claw marks running across the hood. Then I saw him, or what was left of him. Officer Jenkins' body was lying just a few feet away from his truck, twisted and broken like a rag doll. His eyes were wide open in terror, and his mouth hung slack as if he'd been screaming when he died. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that his body had been arranged, propped up against a tree with his arms stretched out like he was welcoming someone home. And carved into his chest were 3 words: "It knows you." I stumbled back from Officer Jenkins' body, my flashlight shaking in my hand. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no explanation, none that felt real. Anyway, the words carved into his chest, "It knows you," felt like a warning meant just for me. The growling sound returned louder this time, echoing through the fog like it was coming from everywhere at once. I gripped my rifle tightly and turned toward the airstream, desperate to get back to Margaret. As I ran through the campground, the fog seemed to thicken around me, making it harder to see where I was going. Shadows moved just beyond the edges of my flashlight beam, tall, thin figures that disappeared the moment I tried to focus on them. When I finally reached the airstream, the door was frozen shut. Ice had formed around the edges like it had been sealed by the cold itself. "Margaret?" I shouted, pounding on the door. "Margaret, open up." There was no answer. I stepped back and aimed my rifle at the frozen lock. With one shot, the ice shattered, and I pushed the door open with all my strength. Inside, it was eerily quiet. The air was colder than outside, and frost covered every surface: the walls, the floor, even our bed. "Margaret?" I called out again, my voice trembling. Then I heard her voice coming from the bedroom at the back of the camper. "Thomas, help me." I froze in place. Something about her voice didn't sound right. It was weak and shaky, almost like she was struggling to speak. I took a step toward the bedroom door but stopped when I noticed something on the floor. Blood. It was smeared across the frost-covered carpet in long streaks leading toward the bedroom. "Margaret?" I said again, my voice barely above a whisper now. I pushed open the bedroom door and immediately wished I hadn't. Officer Jenkins' mutilated body was lying on our bed, his lifeless eyes staring up at me. His mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, and his arms were stretched out as if he were reaching for me. I stumbled back in horror, dropping my flashlight as I tried to process what I was seeing. Then Margaret's voice came again, but this time it wasn't coming from inside the camper. "Thomas." It was coming from outside. I grabbed my rifle and ran out into the freezing fog, following her voice as it called out to me over and over again. "Thomas, please, help me." The fog grew thicker with every step I took until I could barely see my own feet. The cold bit into my skin like needles, but I didn't care. I had to find her. Finally, I saw something hanging from a tree branch ahead of me. Margaret's favorite blue cardigan. It was soaked in fresh blood. "Margaret," I shouted, panic rising in my chest as I looked around frantically for any sign of her. Then I heard it, the growl again. But this time it wasn't distant, it was right behind me. I turned slowly and shined my flashlight into the fog. and there it was. The creature stood nearly 9 feet tall, its emaciated body towering over me like a nightmare brought to life. Its head was a deer skull with jagged antlers covered in dried blood, and its glowing eyes burned into mine with an intensity that made my knees weak. Worst of all was its face, or what was left of it. Margaret's face had been stretched across part of its skull like a grotesque mask, her lifeless eyes staring at me as if she were trapped inside it. I raised my rifle and fired without thinking, but the bullet passed right through it as if it weren't even there. The creature let out a bone-chilling scream that echoed through the forest before lunging toward me with its elongated limbs. I turned and ran as fast as I could toward Jenkins' Ranger truck, praying that it would start despite the cold. When I reached the truck and jumped inside, the keys were still in the ignition. I turned them desperately until finally, the engine roared to life. The headlights cut through the fog just enough for me to see the creature standing directly in front of me now, its skeletal body illuminated by the beams. It tilted its head at me like it was studying me before letting out another scream that shattered one of the truck's windows. I slammed on the gas and drove straight toward it, but just before impact, it vanished into thin air. The truck skidded off course and crashed into a tree with enough force to send me flying through the windshield. As everything went black, all I could hear was Margaret Sipp's voice calling out to me one last time. "Thomas." When I opened my eyes, the sunlight was streaming through the trees. The fog was gone, and the forest was quiet again. Too quiet. I tried to move, but every part of my body ached. Blood trickled down my forehead from a gash above my eye, and my legs felt like they were weighed down by lead. I was lying on the ground near Jenkins' Ranger truck, which was crumpled against a tree like a tin can. "Margaret," I whispered, though my voice barely came out. I forced myself to sit up, ignoring the sharp pain in my ribs. The forest looked different now, less menacing in the daylight, but still unnervingly empty. The airstream was nowhere in sight, and neither was Margaret. I stumbled back toward the campground, calling her name over and over again. "Margaret, Margaret." But there was no answer. When I reached Whispering Pines, it was completely deserted. Our campsite looked untouched except for the deep claw marks on the airstream's walls and the frost that still clung to its surface, despite the warm summer sun. I opened the camper door and stepped inside. Everything was exactly as we had left it, except for one thing. On the bed lay Margaret's bird-watching binoculars, placed neatly on top of her pillow like she had left them there herself. I picked them up slowly, feeling tears welling in my eyes as I realized what they meant. She wasn't set coming back. Days later, new campers arrived at Whispering Pines campground. They found our abandoned airstream with its claw-marked walls and frost-covered interior. Inside, they discovered scratches carved into the metal from the inside out. 2 sets of them, one small and neat, the other deep and jagged. As they debated calling for help, they heard voices coming from the woods. Michael, Sarah. The campers froze in place as their names echoed through the trees. And in the shadows of the forest stood 2 skeletal figures watching them, one wearing a wristwatch and one holding bird-watching binoculars. My name is Frank Russo. I'm 32 years old, and for the past 3 years, I've been living off the grid in a converted school bus. It's not much, but it's mine. A little slice of freedom after everything I went through in Vietnam. Out here, in the Mojave Desert, there's no one to bother me. Just me, my dog Duke, and the endless stretch of sand and rock. It was August 1976. During the Perseid meteor shower, I'd parked my bus on a high plateau near the Nevada-California border to get a good view of the night sky. The days were scorching, hot enough to make your skin feel like it was melting, but the nights were cold, almost cruelly so. Still, I liked it here. The isolation was comforting. Duke was my only companion. He's a German shepherd, trained to help me with my panic attacks and night terrors. He's smarter than most people I've met, and more loyal than anyone I've ever known. He always senses when something isn't right, which is why I started paying attention when he began acting strange. It started when I found some old petroglyphs carved into a rock formation near my camp. They were eerie, Figures with animal heads and twisted limbs, and they made my skin crawl for reasons I couldn't explain. Duke wouldn't go near them. He just growled at the rocks like they were alive. Later that evening, as I was setting up my telescope to watch the meteor shower, Duke started growling again, this time at nothing. He stood at the edge of the bus door, staring into the darkness outside like he saw something I couldn't. "What is it, boy?" I asked. But he didn't respond. He just kept growling. That night, things got even stranger. My ham radio picked up a transmission. A man's voice reciting military coordinates from Vietnam, my unit's coordinates. It was impossible. No one should know those details except me and a handful of guys from my platoon. But here it was, crackling through the static like a ghost from my past. I tried to shake it off as some kind of coincidence, but then a dust devil whipped up around the bus out of nowhere. The wind howled like it was alive, pelting the windows with red sand that stuck to everything it touched. Duke refused to step outside after that. He wouldn't even let his paws touch the sand. The final straw came when I noticed something impossible. Footprints in the hard-packed earth around my bus. Perfect footprints, human ones, that appeared out of nowhere and disappeared mid-step. There were no trails leading to or from them, just isolated prints like someone had been standing there, watching. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the bus made me jump. Every shadow felt like it was moving on its own. Duke stayed curled up next to me, his ears perked and his eyes fixed on the door. Something wasn't right out here. Something was watching us. The next morning, I decided to check the area around my bus. The footprints were still there, perfectly clear in the dirt. I crouched down to examine them, but they didn't make sense. They were too perfect. No scuff marks, no signs of weight shifting like a normal person walking. It was like someone had pressed them into the ground with a stamp. Duke stayed close to me, his tail low and his ears back. He kept sniffing the air and growling softly, like he could sense something I couldn't. I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to feel uneasy. The desert had always felt safe to me, empty and quiet, but now it felt wrong. By midday, the heat was unbearable, so I retreated to the bus. I was sitting at the table, flipping through an old notebook from my Vietnam days when I saw him. A man was walking toward my bus from the horizon. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The desert heat can mess with your head, make you see things that aren't there. But as he got closer, I realized he was real. He looked familiar, too familiar. My heart dropped into my stomach when I recognized him. It was Daniel Matthews. Daniel had been my closest friend in Vietnam. We'd been through hell together, missions that still haunt me every night. But Daniel didn't survive the war. He died right in front of me during an ambush. There was no way he could be here now. I froze as he approached, unsure if I should call out or hide. Duke started barking wildly, pacing back and forth like he wanted to protect me but didn't know how. When Daniel finally reached the bus, he smiled at me like nothing was wrong. "Frank," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Man, it's sips good to see you." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Daniel?" I finally managed to choke out. "Yeah," he said casually, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "My car broke down a few miles back. Thought I sipped walk over and see if you could help." I couldn't believe what I was hearing, or seeing. He looked exactly like Daniel, same buzz cut, same crooked smile, even the same scar on his left cheek from a firefight years ago. But something about him felt off. "Your car broke down?" I repeated dumbly. "Yeah," he said again. "Mind if I use your radio? Need to call for help." I nodded slowly and let him inside the bus, even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me not to. Duke refused to follow us. He stayed outside, barking and whining like his life depended on it. Inside the bus, Daniel started talking about Vietnam. Our missions together, the guys we served with, but his stories didn't sit right with me. He knew things only Daniel would know. Jokes we used to tell each other, places we went on leave, even details about the ambush where he died. But there were little mistakes, words that sounded wrong coming out of his mouth, pauses where there shouldn't have been any. I tried to act normal while scanning through radio frequencies for him. That's when I heard it again, the The same transmission from last night, military coordinates from Vietnam crackling through the static. Daniel's face changed when he heard it. His smile disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. He leaned closer to the radio and muttered something under his breath, a language I didn't recognize, and then turned back to me with that crooked smile again. "Thanks for letting me use this," he said casually. I nodded stiffly, but didn't say anything. That night, Daniel stayed in the bus with me while Duke slept outside under the stars, or at least tried to sleep. He barked off and on all night long like something was stalking him in the darkness. I couldn't sleep either. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt Daniel watching me from across the room. His shadow moved strangely in the dim light, like it wasn't connected to him properly, and once or twice I thought I saw it shift independently of his body. The next morning came with another surprise, blood drops leading away from where Duke had been sleeping. The sight of blood made my stomach turn. I rushed outside, calling for Duke. "Duke, where are you, boy?" My voice echoed across the empty desert, but there was no answer. My heart was pounding as I followed the trail of blood drops leading away from the bus. Each step felt heavier than the last. After about half a mile, I found him. Duke was lying under a Joshua tree, breathing heavily. His fur was matted with blood, and there was a strange wound on his side, a perfect circle, like someone had taken a core sample out of him. It didn't look like an animal attack. It was too precise for that. I knelt beside him and ran my hand over his head. "It's okay, buddy," I whispered. "I've got you." I carried Duke back to the bus and did my best to clean his wound with what little supplies I had. He whimpered softly but didn't fight me. Whatever had done this to him, it wasn't natural. When I stepped back inside the bus, Daniel was sitting at the table flipping through my old military photos. He looked up and smiled at me like nothing was wrong. "Found some memories," he said, holding up a photo of me and my platoon, but something about the photo stopped me cold. Daniel wasn't in it anymore. I snatched the photo from his hand and stared at it. It was a picture I'd looked at 100 times before, me, Daniel, and 3 other guys standing in front of a Huey helicopter. But now, Daniel's spot was empty, like he'd never been there at all. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. Daniel just shrugged. "Maybe you start remembering it wrong." "No," I said firmly. "I know what this picture looked like." He didn't respond. Instead, he stood up and walked to the corner of the bus where I kept a locked storage compartment. Without asking, he opened it like he owned the place. Inside were some old keepsakes from Vietnam, letters, medals, and a pair of boots I hadn't touched in years. "Why are these here?" he asked casually, holding up one of the boots. "What do you mean?" I asked warily. He turned the boot upside down, and something fell out, a bloody scrap of cloth that looked like it had been torn from a shirt. I froze. That compartment had been locked since I moved into the bus 3 years ago. There was no way anything could have gotten in there. No way anyone could have put that bloody cloth inside without me knowing. Daniel smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "You've been busy," he said, in a tone that sent chills down my spine. I didn't know what to say or do. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the boot from him and shoved it back into the compartment. "Get out," I said quietly. "What?" he asked, tilting his head like he hadn't heard me. I said, "Get out." I shouted, my voice cracking with fear and anger. Daniel didn't move. He just stood there staring at me with that same unsettling smile. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "You stare not Frank Russo." "What did you just say?" I whispered. "You said or not Frank Russo," he repeated calmly. "Not really." I backed away from him until my legs hit the edge of the bed. My mind was racing. What did he mean? Who else could I be? Before I could ask him anything else, Duke let out a low growl from behind me. He was standing now. Despite his injury, his teeth bared and his hackles raised. Daniel's smile faltered for the first time since he'd arrived. He glanced at Duke and then back at me. "You should keep your dog under control," he said flatly. But Duke wasn't backing down. He lunged forward suddenly, snapping at Daniel's leg, and that's when I saw it. For just a split second, as Duke's teeth grazed his pants, Daniel's skin seemed to ripple like water. Beneath it was something wrong. It wasn't human. It looked more like raw muscle or sinew stretched over bone, and then it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "What are you?" I whispered. Daniel straightened up and smoothed his clothes like nothing had happened. "You don't want to know," he said with that same eerie calmness. I knew then that whoever or whatever this thing was, it wasn't Daniel Matthews. It wasn't even human. That night, while Daniel slept or pretended to sleep, I stayed awake with Duke by my side. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. His shadow moving on its own, his skin rippling like something alive beneath it, and those footprints outside the bus that disappeared into thin air. Something wasn't right about him, something dangerous, and I needed to figure out what before it was too late. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of there. Whatever Daniel, or the thing pretending to be him, was, I knew it wasn't safe to stay. As soon as the sun came up, I packed up Duke, grabbed my keys, and tried to start the bus. The engine wouldn't turn over. I tried again. Nothing. It was like the bus had just died. I checked the battery, the fuel lines, everything I could think of, but there was no explanation for why it wasn't working. It had been running perfectly fine yesterday. That's when I felt it. The air around me changed. It was heavy, suffocating, like something was pressing down on me from all sides. The sky darkened as a sandstorm started to form out of nowhere. The wind howled, whipping sand against the bus windows so hard I thought they might shatter. Daniel was standing outside now, watching me through the windshield with that same unsettling smile. He didn't move or say anything. He just stood there, perfectly still while the storm raged around him. I grabbed Duke and locked the bus door, my hand shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. "Stay close," I whispered to him. Duke whined softly but stayed by my side. That's when Daniel spoke, his voice booming over the sound of the wind like it was coming from everywhere at once. "You can set run," he said calmly. "You set calmly." The words sent chills down my spine. I backed away from the door as he stepped closer to the bus. His shadow stretched across the ground unnaturally long, twisting and bending in ways that didn't make sense. Then he did something impossible. He walked straight through the wall of the bus. I froze as he appeared inside, his body phasing through solid metal like it wasn't even there. His skin began to change, rippling and peeling away like old paint, revealing something horrifying underneath. His face twisted into a coyote-like skull with hollow eyes and backward-bending knees that made him look like some kind of nightmare creature. "Yusep seen too much?" He growled in a voice that sounded like it came from deep underground. "I need a fresh identity." Duke lunged at him without hesitation, his teeth sinking into the creature's arm. It let out a terrible screech and threw Duke across the room like he weighed nothing. My heart broke as I saw him hit the wall and collapse onto the floor. But Duke wasn't done yet. He struggled to his feet, growling fiercely despite his injuries. He charged at the creature again, tearing at its loose skin until chunks of it fell away, revealing more of its true form underneath. A grotesque mix of muscle and bone that didn't belong in this world. While Duke distracted it, I grabbed my flare gun from a drawer and loaded it with shaking hands. "Come on," I muttered to myself. "Come on." The creature turned toward me just as I fired. The flare hit it square in the chest, igniting its skin like dry paper. It screamed, a sound so loud and unnatural that it made my ears ring, and thrashed wildly as flames consumed its body. But it wasn't over yet. The fire spread quickly through the bus, catching on everything. The curtains, the seats, even my propane tanks in the back corner. I realized too late what was about to happen. "Duke," I shouted as I grabbed him and ran for the door. We barely made it outside before the propane tanks exploded behind us, sending a massive fireball into the sky. The force of the blast knocked me off my feet and sent us tumbling into the sand. When I looked back at the bus, all that was left was a smoldering shell and no sign of Daniel or whatever that thing had been. I thought we were safe, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing on a ridge in the distance was a figure watching us. A man who looked exactly like me. I stared at the figure on the ridge. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. But there he was, standing tall against the rising sun, looking exactly like me. Same face, same clothes, even the same way I stood when I was thinking. Duke growled softly beside me, his ears pinned back and his teeth bared. He saw it too. I wasn't imagining it. The figure didn't move for a long time, just stood there watching us like it was waiting for something. Then slowly, it turned and walked away, disappearing over the ridge without a sound. I wanted to chase after it, to demand answers, but my legs felt like lead and my mind was spinning. What was it? How could it look like me? And why did it leave? Duke nudged me gently, pulling me out of my thoughts. He was hurt, badly, but he was still standing, still loyal as ever. "Come on, boy," I whispered. "Let's get out of here." We walked for hours through the desert, the heat beating down on us like a hammer. I didn't know where we were going or what we'd find when we got there. All I knew was that I couldn't stay near the bus or whatever was left of it. Eventually, we reached a dirt road where a truck driver spotted us and pulled over. He was an older man with kind eyes and a weathered face. "You okay?" he asked, as he climbed out of his cab. "Not really," I said honestly. "My dog Sep's hurt and my bus is gone." He looked at Duke and frowned. "Poor guy," he said softly. "I will take you both to town. There's Sep's a vet there who can help." I nodded gratefully and climbed into the passenger seat with Duke in my lap. The truck driver started talking as we drove, asking questions about what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to answer most of them. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? As we drove farther from the plateau, I started to relax a little. The desert felt less hostile now, less suffocating. Duke fell asleep in my lap, his breathing steady but shallow. Then the driver spoke again, and what he said froze me in place. "You know," he said casually, "I picked up a hitchhiker earlier today who looked just like you." My heart stopped. "What?" I asked quietly. "Yeah," he said with a chuckle. "It was weird. Thought you might been twins or something." He glanced at me briefly, before turning his eyes back to the road. He said his name was Frank Russo too. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what he was saying. "Where did you drop him off?" I asked urgently. "Couple miles back," he said casually. Said he needed to find a doctor for his dog. I felt sick to my stomach. The truck driver didn't notice my reaction. He just kept talking about how strange it had been to meet someone who looked so much like me. But all I could think about was that figure on the ridge, the one that had watched me burn my bus, and how it had disappeared without a trace. When we reached town, I thanked the driver and took Duke straight to the vet. They patched him up as best they could and told me he'd need rest but would recover eventually. As for me, I wasn't sure if I'd ever recover from what happened out there. 2 weeks later, I heard rumors about a hitchhiker wandering through nearby towns, a man who looked exactly like me, but whose shadow didn't match his movements. People said he kept asking for rides and always mentioned needing help for his injured dog. I never saw him again, but sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I feel like someone is watching me from just beyond the edge of the light. And Duke? He still growls at shadows that aren't there. My name is Patrick Callahan. I'm just an ordinary guy trying to fix his life after messing it up pretty bad. I used to work in the coal mines, but after an accident that left me with more guilt than I could carry, I switched to selling insurance. It didn't help much. The guilt stuck around and I started drinking to drown it out. That didn't make things better either. It nearly cost me my family. This trip was supposed to be a fresh start for us. A way to patch things up with Eleanor, my wife, and reconnect with our twin boys, Michael and Jason. We'd bought this shiny new RV, a 1963 Winnebago F-19, and planned a little road trip through the Appalachian Mountains. It was October, just before Halloween, and the trees were all dressed up in bright reds and oranges. But as we drove deeper into West Virginia, the colors faded into dull browns and a heavy fog rolled in. We got lost somewhere along the back roads. The map wasn't much help, and the radio had gone silent miles ago. Eleanor sat quietly in the passenger seat, her fingers twisting her wedding ring over and over. The boys were in the back, whispering to each other in that strange twin language of theirs. They'd always been close, sometimes too close, but lately they'd been acting even weirder than usual. "Look," I said, trying to sound cheerful as I spotted a clearing up ahead. "There's Steps, a campground. Let Steps stop here for the night." The place didn't look like much, just an overgrown patch of dirt surrounded by trees. There were no signs or other campers around, but it was getting late, and I didn't feel like driving any farther. Eleanor gave me a worried look, but didn't argue. We parked the RV near what looked like an old mining office, its windows boarded up and its roof sagging under years of neglect. The air smelled damp and metallic, like wet rocks after a storm. As we stepped outside, the boys ran off to explore while Eleanor unpacked some food. "Don't go too far," I called after them. A few minutes later, they came back holding something they'd found, a battered leather journal covered in dirt and mold. "Look what we found," Jason said excitedly. I took the journal from him and flipped through its yellowed pages. Most of it was unreadable, but one entry caught my eye. "They come at night. The wolfmen that walk upright like us, but are not human. They hunt in packs and howl to call their own." I laughed nervously and handed it back to the boys. "Just some old miner Seps ghost stories," I said. "Nothing to worry about." That night, after dinner, we all settled into the RV for bed. The boys fell asleep quickly in their bunk beds, while Eleanor lay next to me, staring at the ceiling. "Do you think this place is safe?" she whispered. "It seems fine," I said, though I wasn't set entirely sure myself. Probably just some local legend to scare off trespassers. Sometime after midnight, a strange sound woke me up. A long, low howl that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't like any wolf I'd ever heard before. It was almost musical, like someone playing a haunting tune on a violin made of bones. Eleanor stirred beside me. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," I said quietly. "Probably just wolves." But deep down, I knew it wasn't set. I got up to check on the boys, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw their beds were empty. Panic surged through me as I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside into the cold night air. The fog had thickened so much that I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. "Michael, Jason," I shouted. Eleanor was right behind me now, her voice trembling as she called out for them too. Then we saw them standing near the entrance of an old mine shaft sealed off with rusted metal bars. The boys were barefoot and staring straight ahead as if in a trance. "Hey," I yelled, running toward them. As soon as I touched their shoulders, they snapped out of it and looked at me with wide eyes. "What are you doing out here?" I demanded. We don't know," Michael stammered. "We just woke up here." Eleanor hugged them tightly, while I shined my flashlight around us. That's when I noticed something strange. Scratches on the RV's windows and doorframe, as if something had been clawing at it while we slept. The next morning was even stranger. When we stepped outside to pack up and leave, we found bones, animal bones, arranged in a perfect circle around our RV. Eleanor looked at me with fear in her eyes. "Patrick, what's happening?" I didn't have an answer for her or for myself. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The scratches on the RV, the bones arranged in a circle, the boys sleepwalking to that mine shaft. It was all too strange to ignore. But Eleanor kept saying we were just tired and imagining things. She wanted to believe that everything was fine. I wanted to believe it too, but deep down, I knew better. The fog hadn't lifted, and the air felt heavier than before. I decided to drive into town to pick up supplies and maybe get some answers about this place. Eleanor stayed back with the boys, still shaken from the night before. The drive into town wasn't long, but it felt endless. The roads were narrow and winding, with trees pressing in on both sides like they were trying to keep me from leaving. When I finally reached the town, a small cluster of rundown buildings, it was eerily quiet. No kids playing outside, no cars driving by. Just a few old men sitting on a bench outside a general store staring at me like I didn't belong. I parked the RV and walked into the store. The man behind the counter barely looked up as I grabbed some canned food and bottled water. "Hey," I said casually, trying not to sound too nervous. "Do you know anything about that campground near the old mine?" The man froze for a moment before shaking his head quickly. "Ain't sept no campground around here. But we set parked there right now." I said, "It's sep's near some abandoned mining office." One of the old men from outside stepped into the store then, his face pale and lined with years of hard living. "You need to leave," he said bluntly. "What?" I asked, confused. "That place ain't sept safe," he continued. "Hasn't sept been since the Sept 32 collapse." I stared at him, waiting for more, but he just shook his head and walked out again. I wanted to ask more questions, but something about the way he looked at me made my stomach turn. I paid for the supplies and drove back as fast as I could. When I got back to the campground, Eleanor was sitting in the RV with a strange look on her face. She was brushing Michael's hair while Jason sat nearby drawing in a notebook. The boys were quiet, too quiet, and Eleanor was humming softly under her breath. "Everything okay?" I asked cautiously. She didn't answer right away, just kept brushing Michael's hair like she was in some kind of trance. "Eleanor?" I said again, louder this time. She blinked and looked up at me like she'd just woken up from a dream. "Oh, yeah, everything set's fine." But it wasn't set fine, not even close. Later that evening, as we sat around eating dinner, the RV radio suddenly crackled to life. At first, it sounded like static. But then we heard something else, something that made my skin crawl. It sounded like mining machinery grinding deep underground, followed by faint screams. Eleanor turned off the radio quickly, her hands shaking. "It's just interference," she said quietly. But interference didn't explain what we heard or why it felt so familiar. The boys started acting stranger after that. They spent hours drawing in their notebooks, always the same thing, tall wolf-like figures, standing upright around our RV. Their drawings were identical down to every detail, even though they weren't sitting together or looking at each other's work. I tried not to let it bother me, but it did. It bothered me a lot. By now, Eleanor had started talking about the mine entrance more often, how it felt familiar somehow, even though she swore she'd never been here before. She said it was like something was calling her there, pulling her closer every time she looked at it. I decided we needed to leave before things got worse. We packed up our things and climbed into the RV early the next morning. But no matter which road I took or how far I drove, we always ended up back at that same campground. It didn't make sense. I knew I wasn't imagining it, but Eleanor didn't seem surprised at all. If anything, she seemed calmer now, almost like she'd accepted whatever was happening. That night, while everyone else slept or pretended to sleep, I stayed awake watching over them. My flashlight sat ready in my lap as I listened to every creak and groan of the RV settling into place. Around midnight came the sound again, the howling, but this time it was closer than before, closer than it should have been. I checked all the windows and doors again, just to be sure they were locked tight. And that's when I noticed something strange. Our family photos had been taken out of their frames and arranged in a pattern on one of the tables. A pattern that looked eerily similar to what Jason and Michael had been drawing all day. My heart raced as I stared at those photos, the smiling faces of me, Eleanor, Michael, and Jason, and realized that none of us looked quite human anymore in them. Not entirely human anyway. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The howling outside grew louder, echoing through the fog like it was coming from everywhere at once. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined those wolf-like figures from the boys' drawings standing just outside the RV, watching us. Eleanor seemed different the next morning. She wasn't her usual anxious self anymore. Instead, she was calm. Too calm, and kept smiling at the boys like everything was perfectly normal, but it wasn't normal. Not even close. The twins were acting stranger by the hour. They whispered to each other in their secret language more often now, and sometimes I caught them staring at me with this odd look in their eyes, like they weren't really seeing me but something else entirely. I tried to distract myself by fixing up the RV, checking every lock and latch to make sure we were safe. But as I worked, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The twins' teeth. They looked sharper than before, almost like little animal fangs. And their eyes, when the sunlight hit them just right, they reflected back like a cat's or a wolf's. "Eleanor," I said quietly as we sat outside later that afternoon, watching the boys play near the mine entrance. "Have you noticed anything different about the kids?" She gave me a strange look, like she didn't understand what I was talking about. "They stir fine," she said with a smile. "They stir just adjusting to being out here." Adjusting? To what? I wanted to argue, but something about her tone stopped me. It was like she didn't want to hear what I had to say, or maybe she already knew and didn't care. That evening, as a storm rolled in, things got worse. The thunder shook the RV, and lightning lit up the foggy campground in flashes of white light. Eleanor started humming again, the same tune she'd been humming the day before, and this time the boys joined in, their voices blending together in a way that sent chills down my spine. I tried to distract them with a game of cards, but they weren't interested. Instead, they sat side by side drawing again, this time without even looking at their paper. When they finished and handed me their drawings, my hands shook as I held them up to the light. It wasn't just wolf-like figures anymore. It was us. Me, Eleanor, Michael, and Jason, all transformed into creatures with glowing yellow eyes and sharp claws. "I think we should leave," I said firmly, turning to Eleanor. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared out the window at the mine entrance, her face pale and distant. "I can stet," she whispered finally. "I feel like I belong here." "What are you talking about?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. She turned to me then, with tears in her eyes. "I think this is where I was born." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She'd never mentioned anything about being from this area before, not once in all our years together. "I don't remember much," she continued quietly. "But my parents moved away after some kind of accident. Something bad happened here." I didn't know what to say or how to react. All I knew was that we needed to get out of this place before it was too late. But when I tried to start the RV and drive away again, it happened just like before. Every road led us back to that same campground, no matter which direction I went. The storm grew worse as night fell again, and Eleanor started sleepwalking around the RV while humming that same haunting tune under her breath. The twins followed her like shadows, their movements eerily synchronized as they whispered back and forth in their secret language. I locked all the doors and windows and chained them shut just to be safe. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from outside, waiting for us to let our guard down. Around midnight came another sound, the howling, but this time it wasn't just one voice. It was many voices blending together into an eerie chorus that made my skin crawl. The twins woke up suddenly and looked at me with wide eyes. "They sept are here?" Michael said softly. "Who sips here?" I asked nervously. "Our real family," Jason answered with a smile that sent chills down my spine. The storm outside was relentless, shaking the RV with every clap of thunder. The howling had grown louder, and now it sounded like it was coming from right outside the door. I sat at the table, gripping a flashlight in one hand and a wrench in the other, trying to figure out what to do. Eleanor was sitting with the twins on the couch, brushing their hair again like she'd done before. Her humming blended with the storm, creating this eerie rhythm that made my skin crawl. "We can stay here," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to figure out how to get out." Eleanor didn't even look at me. She just kept brushing Michael's hair, her movements slow and deliberate. "They're not going to let us leave," she said softly. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean? Who says they sept?" She finally turned to me, her eyes glassy and distant. "The ones who live here. The ones who've always lived here." I stared at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. "Eleanor, you're not making any sense." Before she could respond, Jason suddenly stood up and walked to the door. His movements were slow and mechanical, like he wasn't fully awake. "Jason," I shouted, "what are you doing?" He didn't answer. He reached for the chain on the door and started undoing it. I jumped up and grabbed him by the shoulders, pulling him back just as he unlocked the last latch. "What's wrong with you?" I yelled. "They're calling us," he said calmly. like it was the most natural thing in the world. I looked out the window then, shining my flashlight into the fog, and my heart nearly stopped. There were figures standing just beyond the trees, tall wolf-like creatures with glowing yellow eyes. They were watching us, their heads tilted slightly as if they were studying us. "Eleanor," I said quietly, trying not to panic. "Do you see them?" She didn't answer right away. When she finally looked out the window, her expression changed, not fear, but something else. Something like recognition. "I know them," she whispered. "What are you talking about?" I asked desperately. "They serve my family," she said simply. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "No, no, Eleanor. They stir not your family. They stir monsters." She shook her head slowly. "You don't understand." Before I could say anything else, there was a loud bang on the side of the RV, like something heavy had slammed into it. The twins jumped up and ran to the window, their faces lighting up with excitement instead of fear. "They set her here," Michael said happily. I grabbed Eleanor by the arm and tried to pull her away from the door. "We need to go, now," but she wouldn't budge. "Patrick, maybe we should just let them in." Her words sent chills down my spine. "Are you insane? They still kill us." "No," she said calmly. "They once hurt us." Another loud bang shook the RV, followed by scratching sounds along the windows and walls. The creatures were circling us now, testing every door and window like they were looking for a way in. I grabbed whatever I could find, a canister of propane from under the sink, and started rigging it into a makeshift flamethrower, using a lighter and some tubing from one of our appliances. "What are you doing?" Eleanor asked as I worked frantically. "Protecting my family," I snapped. She didn't argue or try to stop me. She just sat back down with the twins and started humming again. The banging grew louder, more frantic now, as if they knew I was preparing for a fight. Suddenly, one of the windows shattered, and a clawed hand reached inside. I turned on my makeshift flamethrower and aimed it at the window, sending a burst of fire toward the creature outside. It let out an ear-piercing howl and disappeared into the fog. "Stay back," I shouted at Eleanor and the boys as more claws started scratching at other windows and doors. But then Jason did something that made my blood run cold. He walked straight to one of the broken windows and reached his hand out toward them. "No," I yelled, grabbing him just in time and pulling him back inside. "They're not going to hurt us," he said quietly. "Yes, they will," I shouted back. Eleanor stood up then, her face calm but determined. "Patrick, maybe we should stop fighting." Her words stunned me into silence for a moment. "What are you talking about?" She pointed toward one of the creatures that had stepped closer to the RV now, its glowing yellow eyes locked onto hers, and whispered something that made my heart sink. "That's Sep's my brother." I froze when Eleanor said those words, "That's my brother." She wasn't joking. She wasn't confused. She said it like it was a fact, like she truly believed it. My stomach twisted as I stared at her, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Eleanor," I said, my voice shaking, "that thing is not your brother. It's Sep's a monster." She turned to me with a strange look in her eyes, calm but distant. "You don't understand, Patrick. This place, it's stets where I stet from. It's stets where I belong." "No," I said firmly, stepping between her and the broken window. "You belong here with us, with your family." She smiled faintly, but it wasn't the kind of smile I recognized. "They are my family." Before I could respond, the RV shook violently as something slammed into it from the outside. The twins started laughing. Not scared laughter, but the kind of laughter you hear when kids are playing a game. "They're coming for us," Michael said, his voice filled with excitement. "Stop it," I shouted at him. "This isn't a game." But he and Jason just kept smiling, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the RV. I turned back to Eleanor, desperate to snap her out of whatever trance she was in. "Eleanor, listen to me. We need to get out of here. We need to—" The door burst open before I could finish. One of the creatures stepped inside, its massive frame filling the doorway. It It was even taller than I'd imagined, at least 7 feet, and its glowing yellow eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my knees weak. For a moment, none of us moved. The creature just stood there staring at us like it was deciding what to do next. Then Eleanor stepped forward. "No," I shouted, grabbing her arm. She pulled away from me gently but firmly. "It's okay," she said softly. "They once hurt us." I wanted to stop her, but something in her voice made me hesitate. She walked toward the creature slowly, her hands raised like she was approaching an old friend. The twins followed her without hesitation, their small hands reaching out toward the creature as if they'd known it their whole lives. "Eleanor," I yelled again, my voice breaking. "Don't do this." She turned back to me one last time, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Patrick. This is where we belong." And then she stepped outside into the storm. The twins followed her without looking back. I stood there frozen for what felt like forever, staring at the open door and listening to the howling wind and rain outside. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do. Should I run after them? Should I fight? Should I just give up? But before I could decide, another loud crash shook the RV and everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the RV. My head throbbed and my body ached all over. The storm had passed and sunlight streamed through the broken windows. The RV was empty. "Eleanor?" I called out weakly. "Michael? Jason?" No answer. I stumbled outside into the clearing, my heart pounding as I looked around for any sign of them. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the mine entrance in the distance, but there was no sign of Eleanor or the boys anywhere. Then I saw fresh footprints in the mud leading toward the mine, 2 adult-sized prints and 2 smaller ones, along with something else. Paw prints, huge paw prints that walked alongside them like they were part of the same group. I wanted to follow them. I really did, but something inside me told me it was too late. They were gone now, gone somewhere I couldn't follow. Days later, search parties found me wandering near an old logging road miles from where we'd camped. When they asked what had happened, I told them everything. But they didn't believe me. They said there was no record of any campground or abandoned mine in that area. But I know what I saw. And 3 weeks later, when a boy matching Michael's description emerged from the woods near a neighboring town, walking on all fours and unable to speak, I knew they were still out there somewhere, waiting for me to join them. My name is Rebecca Goldstein, and this is the story of the worst weekend of my life. I don't know why I'm writing this down. Maybe to make sense of it, maybe because it's the only way I can hold on to what little I still remember. It was Labor Day weekend 1985, and my college friends and I had planned one last trip together before graduation. We were all so excited, thinking it would be nothing more than a fun getaway, but Crystal Lake wasn't just some ordinary lake. It was a place that changed everything. We arrived early Friday afternoon in Gregory's rented RV, a shiny Fleetwood Pace Arrow that he'd nicknamed Party Central. Gregory Jenkins was the leader of our group, always full of energy and ideas. He was the one who convinced us to come here, promising peace, quiet, and the best lake in Minnesota. Diane Powell sat next to him in the passenger seat, flipping through her medical textbooks even though we were supposed to be relaxing. She was practical and smart, always looking out for everyone. Henry Takahashi rode in the back with his camera gear, already snapping pictures through the window. He barely said a word but noticed everything. Victor Martinez was sprawled across the couch, tossing a football in the air like he didn't have a care in the world. And then there was me, Rebecca Goldstein, the skeptic of the group. I studied psychology, so I had a habit of analyzing everything. Maybe that's why I started noticing things before anyone else. Crystal Lake was beautiful at first glance, a wide stretch of water surrounded by dense pine trees with mist hovering over the surface like something out of a postcard. But there was something off about it too. The water was unnaturally still, like glass that never rippled, no matter how much you moved near it. And there were no other campers around, not even on a holiday weekend. Gregory joked that we'd scored VIP access, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were alone for a reason. After parking the RV by the lakefront, we unloaded our gear and set up camp. Victor wasted no time diving into the water, while the rest of us unpacked food and supplies. When he came back to shore an hour later, though, something wasn't right. He seemed disoriented, asking us where we'd parked even though he'd been swimming right next to the RV. "Are you okay?" Diane asked him, her face full of concern. "Yeah," Victor replied with a shrug. "I just forgot for a second." He laughed it off, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. That evening, as Henry snapped photos of the sunset over the lake, he noticed something strange through his camera lens, lights moving beneath the water's surface. None of us could see them with our naked eyes, but Henry swore they were there. "It's probably just fish," Gregory said dismissively. "Fish don't glow," Henry muttered under his breath. Later that night, as we sat around a small campfire roasting marshmallows, we heard singing coming from the lake, a soft melody that sounded both beautiful and eerie at the same time. The language wasn't one any of us recognized, but it sent chills down my spine. "What is that?" Diane whispered. "Maybe someone else is camping nearby," Gregory suggested. But when we looked out toward the water, all we saw was fog creeping closer to shore. Before heading to bed, we stopped by the camp store for some extra firewood. The old man running it seemed friendly enough until Gregory mentioned swimming in Crystal Lake earlier that day. "You kids shouldn't be messing around in that water," he warned us sternly. "The lake gets hungry every 10 years. We laughed nervously as if he were joking, but his expression didn't change. "What do you mean by hungry?" Rebecca asked cautiously. He didn't answer, just shook his head like he'd said too much already. Back at camp, I found an old newspaper clipping tucked into one of the RV's cabinets while searching for snacks. It talked about a group of campers who vanished at Crystal Lake exactly 10 years ago, Labor Day weekend, 1975. Their bodies were never found. I showed it to Diane before bed. "This place is weird," she admitted quietly as she folded up her blanket on one of the RV bunks. "But it's probably just stories." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But something deep inside me told me this wasn't just stories. The next morning, things started to feel even stranger. Victor woke up looking pale and confused, like he hadn't slept at all. He sat at the RV's tiny dining table, staring at his hands like they didn't belong to him. "Victor, are you okay?" Diane asked, her voice calm but concerned. "I don't know," he said slowly. "What's my middle name?" We all froze. Victor was the kind of guy who never forgot anything, especially about himself. Gregory laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, man. You're messing with us," Gregory said. Victor shook his head. "No, I stem serious. I can remember it." Diane leaned over and put her hand on his forehead, checking for a fever. "You stir cold," she said softly, "like really cold." Henry sat across from him, watching quietly. Then he pulled out his camera and flipped through the photos he'd taken the day before. His face went pale as he stopped on one shot. A picture of the lake at sunset. In the background, there were shapes in the water. They looked like people, but their necks were too long and their bodies were blurry, almost like they were glowing. "Guys," Henry said, holding up the camera, "I think there's something in the lake." Gregory rolled his eyes and grabbed the camera to look for himself. "It's just shadows," he said dismissively. But I knew Henry wasn't imagining things. The shapes in that photo didn't look natural. As the day went on, Victor got worse. He started forgetting little things, his childhood address, how many siblings he had, but by lunchtime it was bigger stuff. He couldn't remember his mom's face or what his favorite sport was. Diane tried to help him by asking simple questions, but every time she did, he just stared blankly at her. Meanwhile, I couldn't shake what I'd read in that old newspaper clipping about the campers who disappeared in 1975. I decided to go into town and check out the local library while Diane stayed behind to keep an eye on Victor. Henry came with me, carrying his camera like it was some kind of shield. The library was small and quiet, with shelves full of dusty books and old newspapers. It didn't take long to find what we were looking for. Articles about Crystal Lake going back over 100 years. Every 10 years there were reports of drownings or disappearances, always around Labor Day weekend. This can't be a coincidence, I whispered to Henry as we flipped through pages of faded text. He nodded but didn't say anything. He just kept taking pictures of the articles like he wanted proof that this was real. When we got back to camp that evening, Gregory seemed different, distant somehow. He kept staring out at the lake like it was calling to him. Diane told us Victor had barely moved all day and that his body temperature was still dropping even though it was warm outside. That night, Gregory disappeared. We woke up to find his bunk empty and footprints leading from the RV straight into the water. Diane screamed when she saw them, and Henry ran outside with his camera to take pictures of the trail before it vanished into the foggy shoreline. "What do we do?" Diane asked frantically. "We have to find him," Henry said firmly. Victor mumbled something under his breath from where he was lying on the couch inside the RV. "What did you say?" I asked him gently. He looked up at me with hollow eyes and whispered, "He's not coming back." The way he said it sent chills down my spine. Later that morning, as we tried to figure out what had happened to Gregory, I started mapping out all the disappearances we'd read about in town, using a tourist map of Crystal Lake. When I connected them together based on where they happened, they formed a strange symbol, a shape that looked almost alive. "This isn't set random," I told Diane and Henry as we stared at the map together. "Something is doing this." Henry nodded slowly but didn't say anything. He just kept flipping through his camera photos until he stopped on one, a picture of Gregory standing by the lake before he disappeared. But in this photo, Gregory wasn't alone. There was something behind him in the water, a humanoid shape with glowing patches on its skin and long fingers reaching toward him. None of us spoke after that. We didn't need to. After Gregory disappeared, the air around us felt heavier, like the lake was watching us. None of us said it out loud, but we all felt it. Diane kept pacing back and forth in the RV, biting her nails, while Henry sat silently at the table, flipping through his photos again and again. Victor was still lying on the couch, barely moving. He looked empty, like a shell of himself. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. What was happening to us? Was Gregory really gone? And what about Victor? Was he next? That evening, Diane noticed something strange about Victor. He wasn't just lying there anymore. He was sitting up, watching us. But the way he moved, it wasn't right. He tilted his head just like Gregory used to when he was thinking, and when he spoke, his voice sounded different. "Rebecca," he said suddenly, his eyes locking onto mine. "Do you remember that time freshman year when we all got lost on campus?" My stomach dropped. That memory wasn't Victor's. It was Gregory's. I looked at Diane and Henry, hoping they'd tell me I was imagining things, but they looked just as freaked out as I felt. "Victor," Diane said cautiously, stepping closer to him. "How do you know about that?" He smiled, a cold, empty smile that sent shivers down my spine. "I don't know," he said slowly. "I just do." Henry grabbed his camera and started snapping pictures of Victor like he was trying to capture whatever was happening to him. But Victor didn't react. He just kept smiling, that eerie smile. That night, we decided to search the lake for Gregory. We couldn't just sit around doing nothing anymore. Henry rented a small boat from the camp store while Diane packed supplies, flashlights, blankets, anything we thought we might need. As we paddled out onto the water, the fog seemed thicker than ever, swallowing up everything around us. The only sound was the soft splash of our oars cutting through the still water. "Do you see anything?" Diane whispered from her seat at the front of the boat. Henry didn't answer right away. He was too busy looking through his camera lens again. Finally, he stopped and lowered it slowly. "He's down there," Henry said quietly. "What?" I asked, my voice shaking. Henry handed me the camera without saying another word. When I looked through the lens, my heart nearly stopped. There was Gregory, floating just beneath the surface of the water. His eyes were open, staring blankly upward, and his body wasn't moving. "We have to get him," Diane cried out, reaching for the water. "No," Henry shouted, grabbing her arm before she could touch it. "It's not him." "What do you mean it's not him?" she demanded. Henry didn't set answer right away. He just stared at the water with a haunted look in his eyes. It's Sepp's using him. He finally said, whatever this thing is, it's Sepp's using him. Before we could say anything else, something slammed into the side of our boat so hard that we nearly tipped over. Diane screamed as she grabbed onto the edge for balance. What was that? I yelled. Henry shone his flashlight into the water, but all we saw were ripples spreading out in every direction. We paddled back to shore as fast as we could, after that, our hearts pounding in our chests. When we got back to camp, we found the RV surrounded by water, even though it had been parked on dry land earlier that day. It's rising, Diane whispered in horror as she stared at the lake creeping closer and closer to us. That night, we barricaded ourselves inside the RV with whatever we could find, chairs, blankets, even pots and pans. But it didn't feel like enough. Around midnight, we heard a voice outside calling our names. Rebecca, Diane, Henry. It was Gregory's voice. Diane jumped up from where she'd been sitting on the floor and ran to the window before I could stop her. It's Sepp's him, she cried out. No, I shouted, pulling her back before she could open the door. It's Sepp's not him. The voice kept calling out to us, soft and pleading, but there was something wrong with it. It sounded hollow somehow, like an echo instead of a real person. Then we saw it, the thing that had been haunting us all along. It stepped out of the lake and onto shore, a tall figure with translucent skin that shimmered in the moonlight. Its neck was long and twisted unnaturally, and its fingers were webbed like a frog's. Glowing patches of light pulsed along its body like fireflies trapped under its skin. But what terrified me most were its eyes, or rather what I saw in them. Faces pressed against its skin from inside, dozens of them, like they were trapped there forever. It has Gregory, Henry whispered shakily as he raised his camera again. The creature turned its head toward us then, as if it knew what Henry had just said, and smiled with a mouth full of sharp teeth. We didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, the fog had thickened so much that we couldn't see more than a few feet outside the RV. The lake was everywhere now, surrounding us like it was alive, creeping closer and closer. We were trapped, and we all knew it. Victor was barely hanging on. He sat in the corner of the RV, rocking back and forth, muttering things that didn't make sense. Sometimes he'd repeat phrases Gregory used to say, like, "Don't sweat the small stuff," or hum tunes Gregory used to whistle. It was like pieces of Gregory were leaking out of him. "We need to get out of here," Diane said firmly, pacing the small space. "We can just sit here and wait for whatever that thing is to come back." "How?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The roads are flooded. We don't even know where it's safe to go." Henry was sitting at the table, flipping through his photos again. He hadn't said much since last night, but now he looked up at us with a determined expression. "There has to be a way," he said quietly. "We just need to think." Diane nodded. "What if we drive? The RV Sepp's big enough. It might be able to get through some of the water." I wasn't sure it would work, but we didn't have any better ideas, so we packed up what little we had left, flashlights, blankets, Henry's camera, and climbed into the RV. Diane took the driver's seat, while Henry and I sat in the back with Victor. As Diane started the engine and pulled onto the flooded dirt road, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe we could make it out of here after all. But that hope didn't last long. No matter which way Diane drove, the road always looped back to the lake. It didn't make sense. We should have been heading away from it. But every turn brought us right back to where we started. "This isn't possible," Diane muttered under her breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "It's not real," Henry said suddenly from the back. "What do you mean?" I asked him. He looked at me with wide eyes. "The lake itself's messing with us. Itself's not just trapping us physically. Itself's in our heads too." I wanted to argue with him, but deep down, I knew he was right. This wasn't just bad luck or poor navigation. Something was keeping us here on purpose. As we drove in circles, we started seeing things, other campers walking along the flooded roads. At first, I thought they might be survivors like us. But as we got closer, I realized something was wrong with them. Their movements were stiff and unnatural, like puppets on strings. And their faces, they were blank, expressionless, like they weren't really alive anymore. "They stir bait," Henry whispered. As we passed them, "They stirred not real, they stirred just bait." Diane sped up after that, refusing to look at them again. Eventually, the road came to an abrupt end, a sheer drop-off that hadn't been there before. Diane slammed on the brakes, just in time to stop us from plunging into the water below. "This isn't happening," she whispered shakily as she stared at the cliff in front of us. Suddenly, Victor let out a low moan from the back of the RV. We turned to see him slumped over in his seat, his skin pale and clammy. "He's getting worse," Diane said as she rushed over to check on him. Henry grabbed his camera and started taking pictures again of Victor, of the cliff outside, of anything he thought might help us understand what was happening. But when he looked through his lens this time, his face went pale. "What is it?" I asked nervously. He handed me the camera without saying a word. When I looked through it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The creature from last night was standing in the water below us, staring up at the RV with glowing eyes. "It's waiting for us," Henry said quietly. We didn't know what else to do except go back to camp. The RV felt like our only safe place now, even though deep down I knew it wasn't really safe at all. That night, as we huddled together inside, the creature came for us again. It didn't try to break in this time, it didn't need to. Instead, it got inside our heads. I dreamed I was underwater but could breathe somehow. The water was dark and cold, but there was a voice whispering in my ear, soft and soothing but terrifying at the same time. "Memories taste so sweet," it said. "Give them to me." When I woke up gasping for air, I realized Diane and Henry had both had the same dream. We didn't say much after that. There wasn't anything left to say. By morning, Victor was gone, just like Gregory had been. There were no footprints this time, no sign of him leaving at all. It was like he'd just vanished into thin air. We were down to 3 now, me, Diane, and Henry, and none of us knew how much longer we could hold on. By the time the sun set again, it felt like the lake had completely swallowed us. The RV was surrounded by water, and the fog was so thick that we couldn't even see the trees anymore. It was just us, trapped in this tiny metal box, with nowhere to go and no way to fight back. Diane was sitting on the floor, staring at the door like she expected it to burst open at any moment. Henry was at the table, flipping through his camera photos again, but his hands were shaking so badly that he kept dropping them. And me, I was trying to hold it together, but I could feel myself slipping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Gregory's face or Victor's or that thing in the water with its glowing patches and its too long neck. "I don't think we're getting out of this," Diane said quietly, breaking the silence. "Don't say that," I snapped, even though I knew she was probably right. "We need a plan," Henry said suddenly, his voice steadier than I expected. "There has to be a way to stop it." "How?" Diane asked bitterly. "It's steps, not like we can fight it." Henry didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out one of his photos, the one of Gregory standing by the lake before he disappeared, and pointed to the creature behind him. "It feeds on memories," Henry said slowly. "That's why Victor started losing pieces of himself, why Gregory disappeared." "So what do we do?" I asked. Henry hesitated for a moment before answering. "We give it something it doesn't for or want." "What does that mean?" Diane demanded. Henry looked at me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. "New memories," he said firmly. "It can feed on what it doesn't know." At first, I didn't understand what he meant. But then it clicked. If we could create new memories, ones that were painful or confusing or completely random, maybe we could keep it from taking anything else from us. It sounded crazy, but at this point, we were desperate enough to try anything. We started small, telling each other stories we'd never shared before, making up fake memories about things that never happened. Diane talked about a childhood pet she never had. Henry described a trip to Japan he'd only dreamed about, and I told them about a sibling who didn't exist. But it wasn't set enough. The creature came for us again that night. Not physically this time, but in our dreams. It pulled us into a shared nightmare where we were all underwater together, surrounded by faces pressed against its translucent skin. It whispered to us in that soft, soothing voice again. Give me everything. When I woke up gasping for air, I realized Diane and Henry were still asleep, but they weren't dreaming anymore. They were just lying there, staring blankly at the ceiling like they'd already given up. I couldn't let it take them too. I grabbed a cigarette lighter from the RV's kitchen drawer and flicked it on without thinking twice. The flame burned bright and hot against my skin as I pressed it to my arm, and suddenly everything snapped back into focus. The pain was sharp and real, something the creature couldn't touch or take away from me, and for the first time in days I felt like I had control again. I woke Diane and Henry up and told them what I'd done. At first, they thought I was crazy, but when they saw how clear-headed I was compared to them, they understood. We spent the rest of the night creating new memories, burning ourselves with the lighter when we had to, sharing secrets we'd never told anyone before, even making up ridiculous stories just to keep our minds busy. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. By morning, Diane decided she couldn't take it anymore. She told us she was going to distract the creature so we could escape, and before we could stop her, she ran out of the RV and into the water. Diane! Henry shouted after her, but she didn't look back. The last thing I saw was her standing knee-deep in the lake as the creature emerged behind her, a towering figure with glowing patches and faces pressing against its skin. She screamed once, and then she was gone. Henry and I tried to drive away after that, but the road ended again at another cliff that hadn't been there before. This time there was no stopping in time. We crashed straight into the lake. The water rushed in fast and cold as the RV sank deeper and deeper. Henry tried to swim for shore, but he didn't make it. His last photo showed him underwater with the creature looming behind him, and then he disappeared too. Somehow, I don't know how, I survived by clinging to pieces of wreckage until park rangers found me days later. They said I was dehydrated and covered in burns, but alive. But alive doesn't mean whole. I don't remember anything before Crystal Lake, not my family or my friends or even who I used to be. The creature took everything from me except this moment, the one where I'm writing all of this down so I don't forget again. Now I live alone in Gregory's RV far from any water, even though part of me knows it doesn't matter where I go. The walls are covered with Polaroids labeled with basic information. This is your house, this is your name, this is how you brush your teeth. And every night when I close my eyes, I hear singing coming from somewhere far away. Sometimes there's a puddle under the RV when I wake up, even though there hasn't been rain in weeks.